Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. Um, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath thus far. Thank you for studies that we've managed to do. Um, I pray and ask that you may be with us as we go through the second part. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So, just as a recap of what we went through, um, to avoid getting lost in the detail, the conundrum, if I can call it that, or discrepancy that we're trying to solve is, where do the King of the South and the Glorious Land die? Where do they come to their end, and when? In Elder Tess's modeling, it points to the Sunday law. It points to the fact that you have a wound at Panium and then a death at the Sunday law. And that's built on the dynamics surrounding the King of the South, the USSR, in 1989 and 1991, where the death of the King of the South in 1991 would line up with the Sunday law, and 1989 would line up with Panium in her modeling. But when addressing the death of the King of the South, Aldercherry frames it as the King of the South dies in terms of its political influence at the worldwide Sunday law, at Daniel 12:1. In my studies, I've tried to demonstrate that the glorious land, or the sixth kingdom, dies at the same point. What you have prior to that is an internal collapse, an ideological falling away, a breaking apart of the system ideologically inside that system. And so, in each of the different histories that I took us to, I just tried to demonstrate this repeating pattern, this repeating process. And so I hope that the point doesn't get lost in the details of that. I just felt it necessary to defend my point of view because it's in tension with a prior model that we have. And if we're going to do that, if I'm going to do that, I felt it necessary to defend that. And so in building out this structure, I'm hoping to have made my case. Um, just as a reminder of what that process looks like. First, you get warning signs, a prediction, something that serves as a prediction that the end is coming for this empire or this kingdom. With Babylon and its relationship to the glorious land, when Babylon defeated Assyria as at Haran, the city where Assyria made their final capital, in the same year, Necho killed Josiah and installed a king in Judea. So once Assyria is defeated at Haran, um, there's warning signs that Judea should have heard that Babylon is coming. Because if they defeated Assyria, they're going to fill that vacuum. Assyria were our puppet masters and Babylon's going to take over that role. And then you get to Daniel and the Israelites going into captivity. And after that, years later, Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys the glorious land in its entirety. That same pattern we see with Rome, where first there's this alliance. There's a revolt that's happening in Judea, and um, they call to Rome to come and help solve the squabble, but that alliance ends up being their undoing because nearly 100 years later, Pompey is going to come in and is going to insert himself into Judean politics, and it's from that point onwards that you have Rome ruling in Judea. And then fast forward 63, 70, so I don't know the quick maths, but so many years later, and Rome is going to burn down the temple and destroy Jerusalem, really. We see the same process with the papacy, the fall of the papacy. You have a marker, an alliance, which was the Treaty of Tolentino, which should have signaled to the papacy that the system is falling apart, it's collapsing. And then you have the Pope being taken captive. That ideological coherence that existed within the papal church itself, within the King of the North's entity, its nerve center, comes falling down. They go into disarray. And then years later, there's attempts to revive this order, but it's crushed. It's told, we're never going back to this old system of papal dominion. With the USSR, again, 1987 is a pivotal turning point of a year with four major events taking place. The Mujahideen involved in Afghanistan getting their missiles, which changes the trajectory of that proxy war. Perestroika and Glasnost, where Gorbachev reforms the country economically and ideologically with regards to the cover-ups, and Reagan pointing to those satellite states to bring down the Soviet Union wall that divided East and West Berlin. And that should have been a signal to the USSR that our world, the USSR world, is crumbling, is falling in on itself. 1989, that ideological cohesion is broken when all those states, when that wall does come down and all those states start ceding from communist rule. And then 1991, the system collapses in its entirety externally. So that was all to demonstrate that today we have the same dynamic, whether we look at the King of the South, Russia, or the Sixth Kingdom, the Glorious Land, where Panium 2021 serves as an agitation, a marker that the end is coming for these two kingdoms. The National Sunday Law 2024 serves as the marker for an internal death. I think we still need to do a bit more work as a movement to understand what that internal death for the King of the South meant. For the Glorious Land, I think we can see it a bit more clearer that this belief in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, this way of interpreting the Constitution and etc., comes to an end. The things that were meant to make the Sixth Kingdom the Sixth Kingdom, its ideology, its worldview in relationship to those two documents, stops. It comes to its close. But it's not until we get to the worldwide Sunday law or Daniel 12:1 or the close of probation, however you want to frame it, that you have these kingdoms, the King of the South or the Sixth Kingdom, ceasing to rule in their relationship to the wider world. So that's just a recap of what we did. And so my hope or intention for the second part of this study is to summarize the various studies that I've been doing. I'm coming to a close with regards to my presentations in the movement. Um, and so I was hoping to recap where I started, where I've come to, and hopefully it will serve as a foundation for where my studies will lead to going forward, at least. Um, so the first thing that I started doing, and then this study I'm hoping can be a lot more interactive, where you can pop in your questions as we go along. Um, and maybe if you have wider questions, we can do a Q&A at the end, but perhaps we can do questions as we go through it. So I guess the first study that I would say launched my studies into the Sunday law were about 273. This waymark that we have between Panium and the Sunday law. And the reason why I found that important myself to try to dissect and understand was because when Altes initiated these studies, she framed it as this alliance between Egypt and Rome. Rome had been caught up in this warfare between the king of the south, Pyrrhus, and it defeats Pyrrhus in Beneventum, and then ends up being a big player on the world stage. And it's this that leads to Rome's rise, the Rome that we expect to see at the Sunday Law. So when I did these studies, I think the first time I did so was in 2022 or 2023. Um, I didn't fully understand the relationship between that and this in terms of where the studies would lead to. But I guess in my own words, as you pass through the ground, pass over the ground, you understand things better. And so in that study, I tried demonstrating how Egypt, when they saw Rome as an ally, a potential ally that they could use. Um, Egypt was fighting with Seleucus, with all these other regional powers. They weren't interested in Pyrrhus because Pyrrhus was dead. Pyrrhus had been kicked out of Italy. Pyrrhus wasn't really a world superpower. Egypt was. Um, and so it thought that we could use this ally in trying to defeat Seleucus. And so they reach out to Rome, and Rome, being the king of the north, Egypt seeks an ally in the king of the north. When Aldates originally did those studies in Arkansas in 2018, she would put the UN here and she would put the papacy here. The papacy as the king of the north and Egypt as the UN. But as a movement, our understanding of these symbols has grown, has developed. Instead of seeing the UN as being the kingdom that rules the world, we correctly identify it as the USA, as a state power in its state element. So the military, economic, political part that makes up this system. And as Elder Parminda has started demonstrating, and I think for a lot of us, the King of the North has taken a different shape. Instead of being the papacy, it's the USA as well. Specifically, an ideology that manifests itself in this King of the North, USA. So this study, the purpose of this study was to understand the union, that threefold union that talks about the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. The dragon in this story would be Egypt because it's the state, it's your kingdom that rules the world. And at least in how Ellen White frames it, your false prophet is going to be apostate Protestantism, is going to be your king of the north, really, in that story. And so your ideology is going to come into union with the state to form an alliance where the state seeks to rule the world. Now, this is a pretty simplistic explanation of this relationship. But the reason why this becomes important for me is when we look at this waymark and we try to determine what this waymark is about in terms of application, the application that I've made in the past is the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. This was the state, so a political entity, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, which represents the state, making an alliance with a specific ideology that manifests itself in the false prophet. So, by the state sending the abortion question back to the states under a libertarian argument, they essentially formed an alliance with the King of the North because the King of the North, um, if we're going to simplistically call it the false prophet, is doesn't want abortion rights, and so now they come into union. That plays a role in understanding this threefold union that we see throughout the Sunday law period. So that served as a launching pad because understanding libertarianism and how it relates to the states is going to affect our understanding of the seventh kingdom. As we go back in history and dissect this weaving between the sixth and the seventh kingdom, it becomes important to understand the underlying ideology of this seventh kingdom, which I'm suggesting is this libertarian philosophy. So I know I'm summarizing stuff, so the hope is that you've you've perhaps seen these studies before. Um, but after that, in November, I think it was 2024 in the UK, I did studies on the role of conservative parties in democracies. So before I move on, if you have or haven't seen this study, did you have any questions about that? On what was going on and why this waymark is 2022 June 24? Um, okay, if not, the next step in this process of trying to unpackage the Sunday law was understanding conservative parties. Now, why this becomes important again for me is if we're going to understand who the sixth kingdom represents and who the seventh kingdom represents, I don't think it's as straightforward as saying Democrats equals sixth kingdom and Republicans equals seventh kingdoms. A more robust framing is the establishment, which is the sixth kingdom, and your revolutionary populist movement that makes up the seventh kingdom. So when I considered the role that conservative parties play in democracy typically. Sorry, let me just write this down fully. I'm just going to call it populism. When we consider the role that conservative parties play in democracy, there's a repeating pattern that we see. In democracies that flourished, when this wave of democracy swept through Europe and the Americas, there was a stabilizing force at the beginning of those democracies that determined whether this democracy is going to succeed or this democracy is going to fail. It all really laid in the hands of your conservatives. In Europe, it was your monarchies who could either choose to buy into the democratic reforms that were being urged or they could suppress them. And the nations that suppressed the democratic reforms ended up failing, ended up falling apart. Um, an example of a democracy that ended up doing well because the conservatives adopted those reforms is the UK. The early conservative parties bought into the democratic reforms that were being suggested, and you ended up having democracy flourish pretty well. But in nations where democracy was unstable because conservative parties didn't want to bring in those reforms, you ended up having turmoil. And the example that I went to was the Weimar Republic to Germany. You had the monarchy in Germany with the empire and etc. And as democratic reforms started coming in, conservatives in that system didn't want to make progress with the changes. Instead, they ended up handing over power to a beast, an entity that broke down the progress that democracy had made. And so that's the story of Hitler. When you go to 1933 Hitler and you see the dynamics between the different parties and the fight for power, it was your conservative parties that essentially handed over the keys to Hitler, but specifically your center right parties. So in each of these stories, it's your center right parties that end up determining whether democracy is going to die or democracy is going to live. They, in seeking power from the left, saw that they were losing a grip, your center right parties, and the only way to get power back was to make a deal with your far right party, Hitler, the Nazi party. But in doing so, they opened up a can of worms because Hitler is going to hijack the system and is going to take over Germany and usher in the era that we know about Nazi Germany. And so your conservative parties in that story end up playing a role. And I've likened this to Julius Caesar's rise, where Julius Caesar is going to step up onto the world stage, and the opposing forces that are going to try and defeat Julius Caesar are again your establishment conservative politicians. I can't remember their names. One was Quintus and one was Publius in 63 BC. They're going to try and resist this populist that's rising up, this up and coming young blood populist, and they fail because everyone just votes for the populist. And the typical trend that you see is that under economic crises, people tend to gravitate toward populists. So these conservative parties that we have as forming the stability for a democracy end up playing an important role. So when we go to its birth, you have conservative parties and you have liberal parties. Now, when Republicans look back at that history, the birth of the USA. You might have heard the term classical liberalism. They cite that as being the ideological bedrock of the Republican Party. It's classical liberal. Now, that term doesn't mean what we associate with socially liberal today. It's pointing to, as the name suggests, the classic form of liberalism that existed in the birth of the nation. Because when the nation was being born, there was a fight between two worldviews of what type of government the USA is going to be. Is the USA going to just be a kingdom, like the old world? Are we just going to invest power in the executive branch and create a king? Or are we going to invest power in the states, give them autonomy to run themselves? And that's where we have this debate over states' rights. So either your executive branch is a king who holds all the power, and that's your federal system, or you have states' rights, where your states are going to have the right to govern themselves. And what they end up doing as a nation is compromising, and you get what is called federalism. Your states' rights arguers or politicians are going to make the case that we can't invest too much power in the king, so let's give the states rights. And that's what we end up seeing as being the bedrock for the slavery issue in 1850. Because there's going to be this question of whether the USA abolishes slavery, and there's going to be this resistance from your anti-abolitionist movement that is going to draw on this states' rights argument or philosophy that you, the federal government, do not have the right to tell us, the states, what to do. You can't come and step on our turf, because once you do that, you're exerting authority that you don't have. And when you do so, it's reminiscent of the king that we ran away from Europe. And then you fast forward from 1850 to 1888 to 1898. Through the ages, there's been this tension between states' rights and the federal government. Where should power reside? And in my understanding, at least, this is this weaving, this tension between the Sixth Kingdom and the Seventh Kingdom. Because in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson is going to make the argument that we need to turn our backs away from this monarchy, this king, Britain, and we should have the right to govern ourselves. And so when he writes that Declaration of Independence, he outlines how humans, have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that the government that exists through the consent of the government, through the consent of the people, is put in place to protect those rights. Now, that Declaration of Independence stood as the principles, but to ensure that the kingdom flourished, to ensure that the Sixth Kingdom remained the Sixth Kingdom, it needed to be institutionalized. You can have principles on one hand, but if you don't take those principles and formalize them, put them into law, into a legal framework, then those principles cannot be enforced. And that's what you end up having with the Constitution. You have the different amendments, the Bill of Rights, and the different clauses at the Constitution's birth that package those principles that Thomas Jefferson wrote down in his Declaration of Independence. But each time you have this pushback against what is thought to be a king, it comes from this libertarian fight for freedom. And that's what this draining the swamp undercurrent stems from. It stems from this belief that the establishment has become a monarchy, so we, the people, need to fight against the system. So when you get to January 6th and you have all those Republican supporters trying to storm the Capitol, it all stems back to this libertarian belief that the USA um, shouldn't can't be a king, can't be invested with so much authority that it takes away from our freedoms. But in doing so, I guess what the King of the North doesn't realize is that they've created the very thing that they're trying to, or they were trying to fight against. So when we go through history and we try to understand the tension between the sixth and the seventh kingdom, I think it's important to look back at where the seventh kingdom's spirit began, where its ideology comes from. Remember that the seventh kingdom is going to be used by God for a work. So there has to be something that this seventh kingdom believes in that God is going to use to, I'm going to say it badly, take advantage of to punish the sixth kingdom. I've done studies on what I think are the failures of the sixth kingdom. To put it simply, not using the institutions that God gave the sixth kingdom to bring about the progress that they were supposed to bring about. But in essence, when going through these studies of conservative parties and the various perspectives I've given of it, it was trying to make the point that your establishment conservatives play a role in keeping the sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom. If you think of conservatives as, this structure that believes in law and order, it's there for a reason. Because if you have this progress without institutionalized framework, the system ends up collapsing. And so when Trump and MAGA and the Tea Party are going to fight against the swamp, they're not just fighting against Democrats. They're not just trying to take away power from Democrats. They tried that and they recognized that, hold on, if we're going to get power, we have to purge the Republican Party. And who they end up purging from the Republican Party is those right of center Republicans, your establishment Republicans, what I'm going to frame as your conservatives. Those far right elements end up exploiting libertarianism to the demise of the backbone of democracy, your conservative parties, which I know is different to something we may be familiar with regards to who the defender of democracy is. But if we see these two streams of thought running through history, you can't have the progressive state, which the Democrats end up fulfilling the role of to a large degree, without your conservative parties, without this union towards a greater goal. So a big portion of my studies have centered around how the defenders of democracy are actually conservative parties. And that for me is the argument as to why July 18 is the Sunday law. Because once you have your conservative party purged out and you have this populist king now taking hold of the Republican Party, you've not broken democracy, but you've reached a point where the seventh kingdom is able to rule without restraint within its ranks, within, as we spoke about internally. Um, in
Just,
addition to, yeah, go on.
just a question. So,
Yeah.
um, we see, so if I understand, it's really, there's a term for that, the gatekeepers of democracy were center right. Is that how you frame it? So, is there a place where we could talk about the failure of the Democrats as well, or not at all? Like, is that they have no play at all? Because I understand, they are the parasol of the establishment.
Mhm.
So, or is it like, do you separate them completely? They have no play at all, or they enter? I mean, you can add them to the center right. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
No,
Um,
I fully understand your question. I'm just looking for a quote. I can't find it. If someone finds it, then please could you post it into the chat. But when talking about the Civil War and the sin of slavery, um, Ellen White is going to point to failures of the North and the South. But I think it's important to distinguish between what she highlights as the failures of the two entities because their failures are different for different reasons, and so the judgment is over different issues. So when she talks about the North, essentially what she says is, you've not done enough. You've played around for too long in addressing the slavery question, and God is going to judge you. So if we think about ancient Israel comes to its close. The economic system that made up ancient Israel falls apart because God recognizes that I gave you various institutions. I gave you the sanctuary, I gave you the Sabbath, I gave you the way in which you apportion land, that whole Jewish economy, if you want to call it that, the institutions, for you to protect the people of the glorious land, for you to understand me better by understanding your neighbor better. And by the time you get to Christ, Jesus' advent, Jesus and John are going to point to the Pharisees that you've hijacked my institutions, the institutions that I gave you. You've abused them, and now they've become self serving. So, those institutions I gave you are no longer doing the job that they were meant to do. The job that they were meant to do was to protect certain principles that were meant to make the land glorious, the glorious land, to make Israel great. But instead, when you abuse these principles, they end up serving, when you abuse these institutions, they end up serving your own principles, self service, essentially. So if we take that parable or those historical examples, ancient Israel and the North, and we try to understand the sin or the failure of the sixth kingdom, it can be understood in those ways that there were these institutions that the USA had in its constitution with the various amendments, the separation of powers, all the different institutions that make up the USA. They were meant to protect those principles in the Declaration of Independence as a progressive state to grow, to learn as time went on. But as time went on, they do that work when they pass the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Amendment, 1863, and etc., etc., women's voting, suffrage, etc. But then a change starts to happen with the Sixth Kingdom, where it now gets caught up in, if I can call it, self worship, just like the Pharisees, just like ancient Israel. And now they stop playing the game of a progressive state. The state stops progressing. And The best example that we can point to is abortion. The abortion question could have been resolved a long time ago, could have been codified. There were opportunities for the Sixth Kingdom to do that, but they didn't. There have been a handful of times when I'm going to point to the Democrats because this is the example. The Democrats held a supermajority where they could have codified abortion, but for various reasons, they don't. Amongst other issues that should have been resolved in the USA's life. And because of that, sitting on their hands and not being political about their their approach to feminism, really, and the various other issues that plague the USA, not being political in that effort, where the Republican Party, I know now I'm simplifying it, were political. God says, you've been lazy, you've not gone far enough in what your job was to do to create this progressive state. So now I'm going to punish you. And God is going to punish them with the King of the North, who's going to bring Trump and this populist part of the um, far right, essentially. So that's analogous to the North and the failure of the Sixth Kingdom in simple terms. And then your question was about the Seventh Kingdom. Or was it about what was your, sorry, I got lost in explaining that part. It was about these
Yeah,
conservative gatekeepers.
yeah, it was just about what is the role more
Okay.
uh, of the Democrats actually
Yes.
in the failure of the Sixth Kingdom if we look only at the centuries, I mean, at the Republican Party
Party.
being the gatekeepers of democracy. That, yeah,
So
that was.
okay. So that's my explanation of, I'm going to frame it as the moral failings of the Sixth Kingdom. Now, when we consider the center right, what I've tried to say, as you pointed out, or you expressed it, gatekeepers, that's center right because the Seventh Kingdom is was always going to come from the far right. It could never have come from the left because typically your dictators or your populists come from that political spectrum just because of the nature of libertarianism and how it usually finds a home in the right because of the various beliefs that conservatism holds to. The center right had to keep that element at bay. The left couldn't do it because the left are have their own job to do, the progressive state, if you want to call it that. And in primaries, for instance, when you go about choosing your candidates for your party that's going to stand for election, the left can't decide who's going to run on the Republican ticket. It's your gatekeepers who are going to make that decision. So they have a decision to make once you get to your primary, your RNC in July 2024. Are they going to let a populist through because they want power? And with the knowledge that populists have a way of swaying the people, taking advantage of economic crises, are they going to seek expedient political victory and let this populist through? Or are they going to say no, we'll run another candidate even if we have the chance of losing? And the example that I've drawn to in past studies is France, where time and time again the far right under Le Pen, Marie and her father have pushed the boundary of extremism in France, and the right essentially says this is more of a threat than us not having power. So we'd rather collaborate with the left just to make sure that you, the far right populace, stays out. So that's what your center right should have done, but they don't because they want power. And that's what happened with Hitler. So the failures of the establishment, I'm suggesting, is encapsulated in this lack of progressive state and this failure to keep this populist out. Um, but they're two different issues. And there's two different parties that play a role in making sure that this sixth kingdom stays the sixth kingdom. There's your center right, who play a role to maintain democracy, and you have your, we'll just call them your Democrats, your left, who are meant to ensure that the progressive state continues its work. And so both elements of the sixth kingdom, I'm suggesting, don't do their job. They don't do their job function. And so now God is going to punish the establishment with the king of the north. Did that answer you?
Yes, thank you.
Um, so amongst all of that, um, I've tied into my studies about time setting. And the reason why is because we can see that the Republican Party has changed. But how would we know which year the Sunday law would be in? Is it July 2025? Is it July 2026? Is it um, the 2028 election? Like, what year is the Sunday law? So that's the time setting studies that I've done to try and demonstrate is the year of the Sunday law. And I try going to, or I go to 1898 and demonstrate that you have the same dynamics in 1898 that you had in 1888, where you had an external issue and an internal revelation of truth with regards to righteousness by faith. In 1888, you had the messages from Jones and Wagner, Righteousness by Faith, which was essentially Christ in you, the hope of glory. And externally, you have the Blair Bill. Now, I say that in inverted commas because this morning I did studies with Romania, and I didn't end up doing these studies today. But the point that I tried to demonstrate in those studies was that 1888 was never about Sunday laws. There was a Blair Bill, but the issue of the year went beyond the Blair Bill. It was what we would term state nationalism, where you have an ideology so embedded into the state that it takes over the way society is going to run. There were economic issues related to tariffs because there's an election that takes place in 1888, and the key issue in that election was tariffs, whether to increase tariffs with the other nations or cut tariffs or keep tariffs the same. And the president that wanted to raise tariffs ends up winning that election. Um, and that was all framed under this nationalist sentiment to keep to bring back, well, there wasn't really much manufacturing abroad, but to ensure that manufacturing and labor stays within the USA. It was a really anti-globalist movement that made up that election, that brought the USA to that point. Amongst all of that was a piece of legislature that was passed called the Scott Act, which essentially banned Chinese laborers from coming back to the USA. So these were legal residents in the USA who had permits to live and work, who had visas, who made up the majority of the mining workforce. Since 1850, when you had the gold rush in California, the USA needed a lot of labor and cheap labor. And so all these immigrants end up coming from China and working in the mines. And people are starting to feel like this is not working out. Um, these Chinese immigrants are driving down wages for the rest of us. They're diluting our culture, bringing their Chinese culture to America. And there was this pushback to keep them out, essentially. And in 1888, the Scott Act is passed, which said that you laborers who've gone abroad, no matter what your visa status is, you can't come back home. So I've gone through this in a bit more detail, and I'm sorry I didn't go through it today now. But the point that I wanted to make about 1888 is that the external issues that were going on at the time were all about nationalism. The Blair Bill was just a tiny component of it. It wasn't the issue that would have brought about the Seventh Kingdom. And then internally, as I said, you had Jones and Wagner. 10 years later, in 1898, you see the exact same dynamic playing out, where externally the USA is going to go to war with Spain and it's going to become an imperial power. It's going to take over the islands of the Philippines and Guam, the various territories that Spain had been ruling over, and now America is going to become a dragon, really, in its imperial march. I sent over um, a list of quotes, and if you read that, A.T. Jones' commentary is really that the issues that Ellen White spoke about 13 years prior that would bring us to the Sunday Law are here. But he's framing it as American imperialism, as the thing that brings the Sunday Law to fruition, when every principle of the republicanism, sorry, gets repudiated. So externally, you have American imperialism, which is just nationalism. Again, and internally, you have Ellen White finishing her work on Desire of Ages, and it ends up being published. And when you read Desire of Ages and you conceptualize what the key point is that Ellen White is trying to make, it's that Jesus' life here on earth was an example for humanity of how to live out righteousness by faith. So it was the same message that Jones and Wagner were preaching, now with a practical demonstration in the life of Christ. So it's in that framework that I make the case that the 126 brings us from 1898 to 2024. Um, and so that formed the basis of my time setting studies. Um, because, yeah, when is the Sunday Law? Is it 2025, 2026? In my mind, it was to establish 2024. And there were a bunch of other time spans that I went through to try and solidify this in our understanding. So in this point, does anyone have any questions about these 2 years in particular and the relationship between them, and how they point to 2024? So after doing all that, again, this what we're going through is just a recap of the different studies that I've done, as I bring my studies to a close, for the movement. The next thing that I've tried to understand or explain is the relationship between July, specifically the Sunday Law, and what it means for the Seventh Kingdom to rule supremely. And in doing that, there's different models that I've used to show, in my mind, the fact that you have two dates for the Sunday law. For any waymark, you have two dates, a bookend, a start and an end of that waymark. So that's different to the period of the Sunday law, but it's a period of the waymark itself. The examples that Elder Tess gives are 1989, when you have those picnics on the border of the USSR, and then the Berlin Wall falling. November, oh, what were the dates? Oct- September 11 with the picnics, and then the Berlin Wall falling November 9, and then again in 2001, September 11, and then November 9, 2016, etc., etc. There's this repeating pattern where you have two dates to tell a story about that waymark. And so I've tried to articulate how those dates that tell the story of the Sunday law are July 18 and December 17. July 18, when the image of the beast is created, and December 17, when power is given to that beast. Because if that image of the beast is created, but it doesn't hold the executive branch, then it ends up being an, without sounding too flippant, a useless image. It ends up being a lame duck. It can't do anything. And so, in order to rule the world, the King of the North needs the executive branch, which an institution, the Electoral College, gives it in December 17. Um, and there's various examples I've given to demonstrate that. One is the papacy. Before the papacy could rule supremely, it needed to pluck up three horns: the Heruli, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. The Vandals, sorry, Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths. And I've tried to demonstrate how those represent the three branches of government. For the King of the North to rule supremely, it needs the three branches. It needs Congress, it needs the judiciary branch, and it needs the executive branch, or else it can't do what it's going to do in the Sunday law period. And I guess I've already explained what I have to Katya about the sin of the Sixth Kingdom, what I view the sin of the Sixth Kingdom as. Um, because I guess there's various discussions about what that sin is of the Sixth Kingdom. So, in my mind, the best place to go is ancient Israel. If we can understand what the sin is of ancient Israel was, we can understand what the sin is of Adventism is today. And that sin really is the various institutions that God gave our church, the 2520 prophecy, if I can just call it prophecy. Prophecy says, the 2520 says, remember who you are. Remember the Sabbath, remember the sanctuary, remember not to worship idols. Just remember who you are as my people, to progress as a people, to remember your job function. So the institutions that God gives Adventism, God's people, are marriage, are the Sabbath, are prophecy, and various others. But let's stick with those three. We can see how Adventism has, I'll say, abused those three institutions by forgetting them. By forgetting prophecy, Adventism has no bearing on end time events. Um, Ellen White is going to say in that quote that we read in our first presentation, prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events that bring you down to the close of this earth's history, where essentially the workings of the man of sin get revealed. So if you don't have prophecy to tell you those historical events, you're not going to know the working of the man of sin. You're not going to know the sin of the man of sin. And so, because Adventism doesn't have those prophetic glasses anymore by rejecting the 2520, they're not able to recognize the movements and track the man of sin. And if you can't do that, you can't see what the testing issue is today. So, that's one institution. The second is marriage. As I guess we've been hammering home for 7 years now, marriage, when understood through a correct lens, under the lens of equality under the law, was meant to be a blessing to humanity. But because Adventism has remained stuck on an Old Testament version of marriage, Adventism, we can't, Adventism couldn't see the necessity of abolishing patriarchy in marriage, couldn't see the necessity of affording equal rights gay marriage. And when we view the Sabbath in the same lens, Elder Terry will frame it as the Sabbath was meant to be a reminder of the harmony that existed in Eden. The harmony between Adam and Eve, the equality between them, the harmony between humanity and nature, and harmony between humanity and God. So once you don't see the Sabbath for what it is, you end up forgetting that equality that was meant to point us to our equality with God. So those are the three institutions. There's a number more. There's more that we can list, but if you were to ask what's the sin of Adventism, it's that it's abusing those institutions and not being the progressive church that God wanted it to be, to understand God better. Um, so comparing that with the Sixth Kingdom, we can see that the Sixth Kingdom repeats the same sin, abusing its institutions, not recognizing what its institutions were there for in the first place. That comes into import when we consider Acts 27. And at the Isle of Malta, that ship is going to be shipwrecked at the Sunday law. It's going to come to its death. And this is the Sixth Kingdom. So when we consider what the sin is of the Sixth Kingdom, the USA, we can know what the issue is that brings about the Seventh Kingdom. Is it how the Sixth Kingdom has related to democracy? Is it how the Sixth Kingdom has related to its institutions? We need to answer that because the two workings are different. What the Seventh Kingdom does is different to what the Sixth Kingdom does. And hence why I did that. I did that study on the sin of the Sixth Kingdom. And then that brings us to today. I'm pretty sure I've missed out stuff with relation to now this tension between the death of the King of the South, either at the Sunday law or the worldwide Sunday law. Where does that happen? That's a very brief and high level summary of where my studies have come to as I bring them to a close at a wider level. So we've gone on for an hour now, and I don't know if anyone has any questions about any of those studies or anything we've discussed today.
Curtis, I was just wondering regarding the scene, the scene. I know Elder Terry said that the scene was also state nationalism, I think, regarding the Sixth Kingdom or the scene of the US. I don't know if you see that the same way. I know that you've spoken about state nationalism as well.
Mhm.
But yeah.
I don't want to speak for Elder Terry, so I'd prefer to um like describe my studies. Um, but if we think of what the two kingdoms represent, uh, what the two kingdoms were meant to do and what they represent, I think that can point us in the direction of what the sin is for each of those entities. So at least how I understand the sin of the sixth kingdom is that it's related to what I've described, the abuse of its institutions, essentially. Um, yeah, if I can put it that way.
Yeah,
I
that's good.
yeah,
Good.
I know I didn't fully answer your question, but
It's okay. So regarding because it's the sin of the institution, and you've described also that of the abuse even in the SDH church, have you ever considered what would that look like? I mean, what is it, July 18, that would be related to the Adventist church?
so the Sunday law is let me go to ancient Israel because I think that's a good marker. We have the crucifixion that we line up with 2019. I mean, we have Pentecost, which we line up with 2021. And then we have, that's Pentecost. And then we have 34 AD, um, which we line up with the Sunday law. So in that story of Christ, when you get to 2019 or the cross, it's going to be framed as the veil is torn in the sanctuary. The old economy is going to be nailed to the cross because at this point there's no turning back to with regards to the death of the Jewish church, if I can call it that. And so I'm going to speak externally first and then come back to Adventism, if that's okay. So in 2019, once you have this Trump's behavior in 2019, without discussing what it was, it ends up forming the basis that means that 34 AD is inevitable, so to speak. That now the sanctuary system is going to be destroyed completely. So now when we get to July 17, the Sunday, July 18, the Sunday law, and the King of the North comes, the event itself is the King of the North arriving on the stage as a punishment to the Sixth Kingdom in this period, in the period that's going to follow. So nothing particularly happens to the Sixth Kingdom on July 18, but it's a recognition that now the King of the North is going to do a work in this time period to punish you, the Sixth Kingdom, for not upholding your end of the bargain in God's eyes prior to this. So now going to your question about internal, what happened with the sixth kingdom isn't that it did something specifically, it's that it failed to do something. So in 1989, when we say that lines up with 4 BC, when the angel flies over Jerusalem and it sees, oh, hold on, there's no one here who's interested in my work, so I'm going to go to the wise men. That angel does that in 4 BC. We tie that to Adventism's inaction. So in 1989, it's not that we point to Adventism of doing something explicitly. What we say is Adventism didn't do something that they should have done. The thing that Adventism should have done was to recognize the time of the end, recognize the events, and etc. And then when we get to 2001, we say the leadership of Adventism is passed by, and we frame all of that not because they do something, but because they don't do something. and the don't do something in that framing of the story in relation to the message is that they don't pick up the message and they don't develop its time of the end and etc. So now when we get to um, 2021 and the Sunday Law, Elder Test did a study on Ted Wilson's The Sins of the Church and etc. If you remember that, where he's talking about um, LGBTQ rights and etc. And then I can't remember his name. He's a pretty big preacher in Adventism as well. Who
Motivate.
No, not Walter Vaith. He does a study, a sermon on homosexuality in 2022 or 2023. Um, does anyone remember that?
Is it Doug Batchelor?
No, not Doug Batchelor. Let me find it quickly. Mark Finley. So they they initiate this working group to try and address the issues of in the church with relation to same-sex marriage. And so Ted Wilson gives him this this mandate. You go out, you go study the topic, and come back with your conclusions about the topic. And I think it was actually done in 2024, interestingly enough, um, that he does this sermon called "What the Bible Really Says About LGBTQ plus," um, and it's essentially this beration against same-sex marriage, um, and so my point in bringing that up is not to point at that sermon as being the thing, but it's to point at this continual neglect of understanding the institution of marriage properly. So, just like in 1989, it was the idleness that meant that they needed to be passed by. I'm saying once you get to July 18, 2024, it's not that they did something particularly on July 18, 2024. It's that they've neglected what we've described as the institutions that God gave them. And now, through the period of the Sunday law, up until the second advent, God is going to use the King of the North as a scourge against these two entities, Adventism and the Sixth Kingdom. Now, I'm going to ask a question on your behalf because the question just came to mind is when we look at the Sixth Kingdom, you can see explicitly how the Sixth Kingdom stands in opposition or in antagonism towards the Seventh Kingdom. But when we look at Adventism, it seems like they're in agreement. So, how does the Seventh Kingdom end up being a scourge against Adventism? And I'll leave that question with you. Um, and when you have an answer, you can tell me. But before I brought that up, does that answer your question, Katya? That it's not necessarily that they did do something, although they did do all these things. It's that they didn't do a specific work.
Yes, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And thank you for the last question because now it makes me think uh,
Yeah.
how the punishment, so to speak, will look like, knowing that they are going in line
Hmm.
with the Seventh Kingdom.
Yeah.
So
Um, yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer in my mind. It just came to mind as I was describing that. Um, one thing, I guess, to help us as try to answer my own question is understanding who that kingdom is that represents Adventism. Do we still form a part of being representative of Adventism? Because then that scourge could be us against us as a representative of Adventism, or yeah, I don't know. Um, so please, when anyone has any further thoughts about that, let me know.
In the ship, we make the distinction with Paul being already there, but and starting doing a work, but being separated from the institution already.
Yeah,
So,
that's true. Yeah,
but that's a
just
good
for
question.
clarification, Mark Finley does that sermon on August 2023. So it wasn't 2024, but it still serves my broader point that it's the inaction of the church that brings it to shipwreck. Does anyone else have any other questions? Um, if
Oh,
not, yeah, carry on.
sorry. So in your first presentation, you were talking about death and that how we should um, better clarify what death looks like. But I recall that we used to say that it means that you lose sphere of influence regarding the King of the South. I mean,
Exactly.
so that was not like a literal death. Russia is still there,
Hmm.
but they are losing sphere of influence.
Yes. So I tried to be very, um, I'll say cautious, but very strict to what I was describing external to mean. And maybe I didn't relay that correctly. But the external loss is specifically related to the relationship between this entity, this kingdom, and the external world. So it's not necessarily that the kingdom dies. In some cases, you see the kingdom die with the USSR. In other cases, that kingdom does not die. So the papacy lived on. You still have a papacy today that you had then. But what you ended up seeing, sorry, with the papacy is that it's, as you've phrased it, sphere of influence. Its projection on the world stage died. It was no longer considered a superpower, if you can call it that. So when you get to 1991, sure, we see the dissolution of the USSR, but what was really dying was its influence on the world stage. That came with it dying, literally, but even without its death, if you just had them saying we're going to keep the USSR in name, but everything else happened with all those states declaring their independence from the USSR, it no longer would have had the stage or the prominence that it had externally to the wider world. So now when we go back to 1991, this is why I think it's important where you line it up. Does it line up with the Sunday law, or does it line up with the close of probation, with the worldwide Sunday law? Which is why I felt it important to go back into those histories, see what was dying. And in my explanation, the thing that's dying is the influence that this kingdom has with the nations around it, with the world, external to itself. And I guess my understanding is that 1991 lines up better with the worldwide Sunday law, which is contrary to what Elder Tess has taught. I know that. And we need to ask ourselves the question, which is correct and why is it correct? Um, so yes, simple answer, yes, to your question. It's about spheres of influence, and I don't necessarily think that is limited to the like the countries that it holds within its influence. I think it's specifically related to the influence that it has on the world stage. So if we think about why Russia wants to what Putin is trying to do with Russia, sure, there's this element of having countries within its spheres of influence, but it wants Russia to be a world superpower. Putin wants Russia to be at the same level or as the USA. And so once you get to a point where it's unable to do that, that for me is a marker that it's died externally, that you cannot be a world superpower anymore. And I liken this to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire hands over autonomy in on August 11, 1840, what it was saying was, we do not have the strength anymore to solve problems on our own because we need you, European countries, Britain, etc., to resolve this dispute with Egypt for us. Prior to that point, because they were a world superpower, they could have done that on their own. But it gets to a point where now they can't do that on their own. And if they can't do that on their own, then they're not really a world superpower. And so that's the external, the influence that it has on the world. That's what dies. So when we consider this external death as I've framed it, I'm not I'd be reticent to limit it to spheres of influence. The influence that is dying is its influence on the world stage to fight for a position of world superpower status. Um, I don't know. Does my explanation of the distinction between the two make sense? That it's not just spheres of influence, as in having countries within. It's this belief of what your nation should be.
Well, Curtis, it definitely fits in terms of Russia. I mean, Putin's whole goal was to, in essence, restore the glory of Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the culture and as you suggest, be a key player on the world stage
Mm-hmm.
in terms of everything, uh, people, culture,
Yeah.
language.
Yeah.
Part of his aggression towards Ukraine, 2014 against Crimea, and then afterwards. Um, it's been this um, push to restore what in his mind once was, and obviously with himself as the head of all the glory that's going to
Mm-hmm.
be restored. And in many ways, it, as we know from Elder Tessa's studies on the polar opposites and polar similarities, North Pole, South Pole globe that she drew uh, back in time, very similar to Trump's "Make America Great Again," right? And restore. I mean, in some cases, back into the late 19th century, in some cases into the 1930s, the 1950s. But this worldwide influence on the world stage aspect that you've brought out, I think is well stated and it fits.
Yep. I like the way you framed it. And just picking up something that you said, not in these words, but I'm going to paraphrase and then throw in my own words, is that spheres of influence forms a part of what the King of the South wants. It's not the whole story. And so if we think about that external death, it can't be limited to spheres of influence. It's much broader than that. It's if I, Putin, am in a room with you, Donald Trump, who's the big dog here? You know, who's in charge? Who's calling the shots? Um, and for for Putin, it's always been I'm the one who can call shots about my kingdom. But that influence or that ability ends up coming to an end. Um, and to put it simply, it can be as simple as Trump saying to Putin, "Stop this war because I'm tired of it." I'm not saying that that's the thing, but I'm just trying to demonstrate that this loss of external power, this external death, goes beyond spheres of influence. It's this projection of, yeah, what that nation is on the world stage. I think Katya, you had originally asked a question and you wanted to unmute. Um,
No, not really. It was just more of a comment that
mhm.
maybe if we don't call it, I mean, here you put 1991, but because I also think of 2021 going to the Sunday law, but if we call it beneventum, then maybe, I know it's the same remark, but I think that if we call it beneventum in regards to the King of the South, then it makes sense that it goes to worldwide Sunday law, because that's the story.
So,
That was just it. I was
okay.
just thinking out loud.
Yep, that's fine. So in the new modeling I'm proposing, in inverted commas, is that there's this waymark that I think we haven't really spoken about it, but it's a significant point in time with relation to the USSR. And so I think that lines up better with Panium, Beneventum, etc. in 2021. That leads us to this point. Worldwide Sunday Law, 1991. So I don't know where my studies are going to lead. I don't know what comes next. Like everyone, I'm in this process of learning and growing and trying to see where the tides take us. And so I hope that in our studies today, I was able to answer some questions. I for sure answered some in my mind. It's funny, whenever I present, um, I end up answering questions that I had myself. This morning in a study with another group, someone asked me a question and I got stumped and I didn't know the answer and I started rambling on. But as I was rambling on, like something clicked for me, and I really was blessed by that experience, where even though I'm sat here trying to teach something, I'm learning in that process as well. So all that's to say is that um, this discussion has been beneficial for me too. And so if there's no more questions, we can close. But just want to make sure, are there any more questions? Okay, so let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath, first of all. Thank you for this token that you've given us to ensure that we remember. We remember all the institutions that you've given us for our benefit, for your glory. Um, Thank you that this movement has been raised up to try and advance the work of progressing your kingdom. Um, Thank you for the studies that we've been able to do as a group. And I thank you that this process doesn't end, this journey doesn't end, that we will spend eternity learning together and learning about you. I praise your name, and I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.